Okay, so we're going to kick things off with a poll. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how mad do you think we have made Mother Nature? I think there'll be a poll coming up if everyone can have a look there. Just give 1 second. Got some results coming in. Oh yeah, love it. Beautiful. Let's have a few more come in. Okay, yep. I mean, Data Science Festival, we need to kick things off with a bit of a distribution and see what's happening. All right, so this poll definitely suggests that we're a part of an audience that is aware that the climate crisis is here. And if you're anything like me, it will often feel big and scary and sometimes very difficult to digest, but it is here. And as humans, generally when there's a really big problem involved, we typically tend to procrastinate, or maybe we even make some excuses as to why we choose not to deal with it and maybe let others deal with it ourselves. It's the classic, I'm one single tiny person. What could I possibly do? What change could I make? How could this actually affect change? Who has felt like that here? Maybe in the last month, maybe in the last week, even today. It's a pretty common feeling, right? And then, does it even make a difference? Once you choose to change your behavior, does that even make a difference? Does it actually count? When it comes to maintaining a healthy ecosystem, every single person has a part to play. And this is why we have a simple solution. And we have a simple solution that doesn't actually involve you changing much of your daily behavior at all. Bear with me. So Sādu rewards fitness activities with trees planted in global reforestation projects. It's a healthy you, healthy planet, all in one and at the same time. We want to make it easy for you to start your journey towards an eco-conscious lifestyle by doing something simple like this, making it a little bit more fun and achievable on a daily basis. So the idea is you invest in your personal well-being and you're rewarded. Quite simple, yeah? What does that actually mean? What does the app actually do? So there's only a couple of steps that you need to do to kick off this environmental change in your life. First things first, we're all about data. So you can sync up your activity data. And we have a variety of data sources that can actually come through straight away, which means you can be set up and running within a matter of minutes, not even. Then the next step is up to you to stay active, to look after yourself. Running, walking, hiking, jumping, tumble turning, ballet, you name it. All of these active activities that you're doing, to keep doing those and maintain your well-being. For all of those activities that you track, this will earn you verified trees. So essentially, the more you're moving, the more trees you're going to earn. And that will end up with an investment in nature-based solutions to climate change. I hope you guys can see the next part of the slide. So based on the number of activities you have, that will actually contribute towards nature-based solutions to climate change. You're rewarded for the steps you take with something that can help the climate crisis. Nature-based solutions are estimated to have the potential to deliver around 1/3 of the target towards net zero. That's a pretty good reward to get. So from these activities and the trees that you earn within the app, just going to move that there. Sorry for that slide pause. in rearranging. I really hope you guys can see my slides now. It's a little bit off-putting for myself. So those trees that we talked about that you earn are actual trees. And users can choose which sustainability partner that we have on our platform, that their hard burned calories and their fitness activities will be invested into. Currently, we have 5 partners on board. Each has a unique approach and it has a unique way of doing things. And each has been specifically assessed against different criteria to ensure that the work they are doing can be verified. We need to make sure that what we're doing actually counts. So for example, one of our partners, Greenstand. Greenstand, as you can see in this little video, has the ability to actually see the trees that we are supporting with a specific impact token associated. So as you can see here, this is in the Sadhu app. We actually have the ability to see this tree, who it was planted by, and all of this other data and information to ensure that we're verifying that this work is actually being done. I think this is pretty cool, not gonna lie. We have data on the tree and the planting side of things, but we also have data on the person who's planted it, as well as other information. And this is important so that we can also start to understand not only the impact on the environment, but the socio-economic impact as well. That will mean that we can look after this tree, we can check on it, we can start to see how it's going to contribute to the crisis over time and for the long term. But wait, there is more. With Sadhu App, our users have the opportunity to acquire a digital representation of a living tree displayed in augmented reality. This acts as a digital representation of the physical tree in the ground. So each digital representation will be mapped to a specific tree or a hectare of land in one of the projects that we just spoke about. So imagine the video that you just saw before, which allows you to start collecting these items and to start to see this evolve over time. This means that climate conscious individuals can start to build a collection of the digital representations. They can start to create a virtual forest, and all while actually contributing to helping trees in real life. So, does that sound cool to you? If so, you can join our Play to Earn marketplace for nature-based carbon removal. And that means you can be part of the solution that is more than offsetting and forgetting. So if you would like to, please feel free to go ahead and download Sādu and check it out for yourself. That's a little bit of an intro into our company and what we're all about. And you can start to see how we have built AR and how we're bringing that into eco-conscious decision-making, all within our fitness gamification app. So I will now pass over to Brittany, who is another co-founder of Sādu, who will continue the conversation on this topic with Hoang and discuss more around AR and eco-conscious decision-making.
Awesome, Elise. Thank you so much for that introduction. That was super helpful. We'll now carry over to a fireside chat. So basically a quick background on myself. I am the co-founder and CEO of Sādu, and I've previously worked in corporate innovation and venture capital, basically supporting different companies and VCs scouting for climate tech solutions in order to improve their business. Through all of that, I kind of realized the difficulty in this large scale organizational change that resulted in a, let's say, operational kind of top down adoption of a new technology to reduce the impact of business processes on the environment. And so all of this made me realize that if humanity is gonna come up with a solution to climate change, it's gonna be bottom up. It's gonna be every single individual deciding to prioritize eco-conscious decision making. And so with that, the idea of Sādu developed into this very easy and let's say fluid solution to reduce environmental impact while also investing into personal well-being, and to help cultivate a sense that the two are really connected with one another. Donating to charity projects and philanthropy is great, but at the end of the day, taking care of the environment is a matter of self-preservation, and it's an investment into a future that we want to be a part of, with a living planet that is lovely. And so this is really the foundation of the overall vision for Sādu. So Hoang himself, who we'll be chatting with very shortly, as mentioned, he is the director of his program, civil engineering program at UCM. Has over 4 years of experience in fieldwork as a lead researcher, and his commitment to climate action has given him every skill set you can imagine, from urban planning, architecture to GIS and disaster management. And so we're here to just get a conversation going and hear from his perspective what it's like to integrate some of this research, his data science, into the different policy making around climate adaptation. So Hoang, I gave you a quick intro, but I'll let you say hello for a second, if there's anything you want to add there before we jump into the questions.
Hello, glad to join. Quick correction. On the timeline, I was the director and founder of the civil engineering program at UCM about 10 years back, and now I'm a current PhD researcher at CHART.
Cool.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I mean, first off, you're based in New Orleans, and so I guess it's probably one of the cities that climate change and adaptation is a bit more evident in terms of action that needs to be taken. So how would you experience just like being in a city where it's kind of at the forefront of the climate crisis?
It is definitely the reason why I chose to move to the city to live. There's a thing they like to say, Katrina made the city the canary in the coal mine. I hate to use that analogy because the canary dies, but it is on the front line, as probably one of the most vulnerable cities, in the United States or even in the world. And every year when hurricane season comes, we have this kind of existential threat. The last year was record setting. I think we had 5 hurricanes make landfall in Louisiana, and we're hoping we don't break that this season because we still have a month left. And then from lessons learned, from our collective memory of Katrina, we all remember that how tragic the human suffering was, as NOLA residents were stranded on top of roofs for days, weeks at a time, and over, I believe it was like 2,000 lives were lost from Katrina. That year set a record, and that was pretty scary back then. And then Ida happened on the anniversary, 16-year anniversary, and once again, it shows how still vulnerable the city is, and continue to be vulnerable. I think from the idea of the climate threat, like last season, 31 named storm hit the Gulf region, and I think we went through, 3 sets of alphabet names: the English, the Greek. I remember experiencing Zeta, end of that, and then we went through the Spanish, and even that was just unprecedented, and I remember meeting for Ida. I think it was like a Thursday. We had a chart meeting about emergency management, and at that time we were discussing how it was, I think, a tropical depression, and within 24 hours it was supercharged over the, I think, 89-degree water, and then it became a Cat 4. And when that happened, no one could evacuate. We had to shelter in place, and those kind of threats still continue even with a month left. Everybody is still recovering. If you drive through the city, you still see roofs with green tarps.
I mean, leading into that, so I think in our earlier conversation, you mentioned that that quick change in the intensity of the hurricane made it extremely difficult, basically, you to do your job, which is ensure there's the research provided to prepare for this type of weather-related event. So that kind of leads us into this idea of adaptation and resilience in the face of climate change. I think a lot of the science is dictated, and especially now that we see the results starting to come out of COP26, that the climate crisis is more or less here to stay, and we're going to have to deal with these changes. And so can you share a little bit about how you kind of define like what adaptation and resilience is, and then maybe an example of how that gets more difficult over time as the climate crisis continues.
Those two things go hand in hand, and that's why it's a great city to live in if you are researching and studying climate change. It's a base case study for that example of adaptation. So, for example, from Katrina, how one of the evacuation was a crisis. How over 100,000 residents were not able to evacuate, and the idea of how this adjustment in more of our social and governmental kind of system thinking in response to that unprecedented impact of Katrina. The city, I think New Orleans was the first and still is the only city that has a city assistant evacuation plan, where if you do not have a means to evacuate, the local, states, and the federal government work together to evacuate you to a shelter where you will be fed. And even lessons learned, adapting to this plan, we will evacuate your pets, because that was one of the markers where people who didn't choose to evacuate because their pets wouldn't be sheltered. So and even now, the lessons learned from Ida, we were not able to call, because the plan initially had a 5-day window, because what happened to Katrina was nobody wanted to pull the trigger to declare mandatory evacuation, because the previous year when you declare mandatory evacuation and it was a miss, that's a lot of economic loss. So the governor, the mayor, even FEMA didn't call it in a sense, and now it was taken off that kind of human aspect. So within the plan, 5 days before even a hurricane make landfall, if it's a Cat 3, mandatory evacuation. So that's already in the plan. But from Ida, this idea of adapting to this new kind of climate model, we only had less than 24 hours to really evacuate. So the mayor could not declare mandatory evacuation, and it created a lot of problems. Even now with the insurance, the idea is certain insurance company won't pay out because the mayor did not declare evacuation, so you won't get money for your hotel or things like that. So new kind of policy things we have to learn and work within the system. But even the idea of resiliency, getting that equilibrium back, to bounce back quick, it's just a lot easier to help people outside of the disaster zone. So we're definitely rethinking, that time window 5 days out. Is there a quicker way where we can modify the evacuation plan so people could be more resilient, in bouncing back? Because what happened here was that there was this same issue, how people who were stuck here could not evacuate, and we were able to, after a few days, gather the information, gather the buses, and then transport the most vulnerable, the elderly, the sick, or even people just after 5 days of no electricity, you just want to, be back to civilization in a sense, and it was like the hottest month. So it was just like that idea of learning from the lessons and how best to move on from the lessons you learn.
Yeah, I think you'd said before that even like coming back and seeing everything from a grocery store, like the shelves are pretty much depleted. There's still like trash everywhere. So even though everyone is more or less now in a safe situation, just moving back into a city after like, let's say an event like that or a hurricane, there are small things that make this adjustment and kind of that need to be planned for a little bit more complex than expected. So yeah, I think moving into that, if I could summarize it, you basically tried to come up with a plan for how to respond on a city level to these different climate related extreme weather events. And you pull some of this information for this plan based off of the research that you're doing. So can you share a bit more about how, like what type of data you're looking at, some of the ways that you kind of interpret your research to then inform policies or evacuation plans that are made as a result of your work?
Yes, predominantly my work deals with mitigation, less so with like preparedness, emergency preparedness, and mitigation is probably the best bang for your buck. For every dollar you spend on mitigation, it pays for like 8 folds in response or recovery. And one of the data we have collected was it's almost 40 years of FEMA flood data, and we collected 140,000 property. We surveyed them to look at the mitigation, looking at the height, looking at what kind of construction. And with that model, put into a GIS, using that GIS photo survey, put into GIS database, and then connecting with multiple variables. And one of the variables that might be interesting, because I think we had a discussion about how we were able to map the millions of trees in New Orleans, their location and also what kind of species. But one of the critical things that we learned, the damage that was created through falling trees, because each time a tree falls, it takes down electrical, communication, or even water line, because when the roots pop up, it breaks the water line. So if understanding that data is important. For example, one of the things that took a lot of time was waiting for the Energia, the electrical company, and the public work departments work together to address response, how to get electricity and water back quickly. And usually if what happened is like somebody would drive up to it there and they're like, oh, we can't do anything because someone has to cut up the trees because that's public works. Because we only do Energia, we only do the cable or the communication, Cox does the communication line. So this idea of like, how rapidly can you collect these data in response? And one of the way is using, there's a program called Azure Collect, where even you can do citizen participation, where through it's like relatively like a extended reality, augmented reality kind of thing, where you could just use your camera, take a video, hit the kind of GPS, and then add on GIS data. Like, is it a telephone line? Is it a tree that's fallen? What is it that you want the city government worker to fix? Because usually it took them a week or longer to assess, but because they have to drive through every street and then make sure is there a tree, is there a line, and then they drive back within a week or two, that's when they come back. But imagine taking that first week out and then getting electricity back on relatively quick. So using these type of new tech, I think is very valuable. A lot of cities are looking into that. I don't believe they quite have the money, depending on how well funded they are. But this is the new model of climate change, where cities have to heavily invest in mitigation and preparedness, so you don't waste so much money in response and recovery. And this is the model that most cities, hopefully within the United States and probably internationally, because and speaking of the international, like what happened this year between Germany and the Netherlands, which is unheard of, how they never thought they were in danger. So for them to understand, how do you get service people, because they were just driving around on fire trucks screaming into windows, hey, you need help? And they're like, if you're not dying, they won't pick you up. So they need a plan like we have, beforehand, instead of rolling your dice with Mother Nature. I think for me, I put a 10. She is super angry.
I mean, that's super interesting. So even if we have the information, basically, like the way cities and government is set up right now, like there really needs to be like a holistic response and communication between each department in order to get things moving or get this response and mitigation move more quickly. So like while the data and the information may be present, there's still a lot of advocacy in terms of policymaking and how government is oriented to be able to then implement any useful pieces of that information. Is that correct?
Yes, I think definitely for, because we are, and once again, I'm surmising that we are data scientists. There's definitely a chasm between the data people and then how best to implement it in the government, policy side even, and I think there has always been a lag, how even the idea of communicating that data is, I think, really important. And I think we could probably further discuss this about how augmented reality can be used as a way to really simplify complex data in an understandable manner, so people who are decision makers can make the right decision. I think a lot of time there's definitely a lag. If you do any kind of data scientist, collecting it, then analyzing it, then writing a report, and then maybe the government official will read it. And if they do read it, hopefully they will understand all the graphs or maps or all the kind of model you predicted. And then by that time, that report is probably obsolete, because it's probably a 5-year window that finally, when the policy happened, either happened, emergency city assistant evacuation plan did not quite work, because even We did a wet wash. I believe it's 2017 where we got $100,000 from the federal government to do a full city evacuation kind of exercise. It's unheard of because most cities do like, chemical spills or, lone shooter, but they don't do specifically for evacuation because it's just evacuating, hundreds of thousands or millions of people. It's just unheard of before Katrina, because Katrina was the first large urban population that declared mandatory evacuation, and as you could tell, that did not work out so well. And even with looking at how cities can use data, like clustering, which population is it. One data you could put is for example, like how many people are not evacuated and how many people are evacuated. That data is very vital. There's plenty of ways, depending on which government you're from, to access that data. And it could be, non-intuitive, just like how many cell phone towers are getting pinged, not knowing specifically the person, but the amount, the quantity of people within that sector, and even giving them the right information, like this road is blocked off, you can't evacuate from this route, or you're heading that way. You need to do detour because there was an accident, or there was, because one of the lessons I learned from Rita was that more people died during Rita evacuation than the hurricane itself. Because what happened, they didn't have an evacuation plan. They all left like the Houston, Harris County area. And then with one person runs out of gas, everybody pretty much behind them or just stuck on the freeway. And you get elderly people who were stuck in a 100-degree car, and that's when deaths happen because they did not have what they call contraflow, where they make all routes going out. They have all emergency people on the road to help you. If your car breaks down or you need special kind of EMS, they can activate that. But it's a lot of planning, a lot of money, but this is the new model of climate change.
So it's interesting, like on one hand, to make it relevant, you have to come up with an analysis that would be applicable to say 5 to 7 years in the future, to then have it go through kind of the governmental policy decision-making process that's per usual. But a lot of times the information that we need is much more immediate. And so there's a mismatch there. But I think this is also interesting because it's very different from, I think, what we hear a lot in the climate space and around AI and data analytics, which is more climate modeling. So that's the prediction, like let's say weather pattern predictions that would lead into the future. So this is kind of a much more nuanced analysis that impacts people's daily lives, and will continue to be more relevant in the future. So I think it's pretty cool to look at, let's say, climate science from another perspective as well. Can you share a little bit too about what you're working on with Sisyphus, since you'd mentioned augmented reality a bit earlier, and how that can actually help someone who's like not from a background in data science understand the research that's being done?
And yes, be glad to. And for example, the two kind of heavy set analysis or data that I mentioned last time is the risk. What is your flood risk through the FEMA flood data, and then the mitigation is your property, like each individual property. And one of the aspects that you can show is how can communicate that risk in an understandable manner, like I previously mentioned, but that will allow residents to take action. So they don't just look at it and then what's the point if they don't take action? And we try to connect it to their specific home. So one of the features that you can turn on your camera from your kind of smartphone, and once again, an equity issue does apply if you have a 5G or a smartphone, but you can see specifically your flood levels. If it's a 10-year flood, it's a 100-year flood, or a 10% chance, or 1% chance of flood, this is how high the water level will be, or the base flood elevation. And you can see which part of like the beloved home that you live in, which furniture, your grandmother's rocking chair will be underwater. And then with that, it also quantify the cost of how much it will cost. And then you don't do the doom and gloom. You always have to give an option. And if you, let's say, do, for example, green infrastructure for the more everyday kind of rain event, if they're slab on grade, low to the ground, or if you're doing like the more kind of 100-year Katrina plus kind of storm, this is how you mitigate. This is how much that mitigation will cost, which is relatively expensive if it's existing building, but it's relatively inexpensive if it's a new construction. So for example, average is $8,000 to $10,000 just to elevate that building to freeboard standard, which is that extra foot above the base flood elevation. But it just shows you how much money you save in flood insurance, or how much money you save in flood damage. These are the kind of things that I think using augmented reality could be more effective in communicating and then having people take actionable steps. I think even, for example, when we more looking into the previous event of Katrina, when you develop any new tech, it's always this kind of design thinking, learning kind of process. I remember years ago, we did a beta test with the city where we did emergency response app, where, for example, one of the issues that we learned from Katrina and also Ida was that like during this time, the people who haven't evacuated, it's very difficult for them to get the things they need, you know. And one of the issue, I remember insulin, which pharmacies open and if they have insulin. And we tested this literally almost 3.5 years ago, but it took them that long to, or still have not implemented, because it's just any kind of government sector, it takes a while. And the idea of that, like we were able to register all the businesses, for example, the pharmacy or the gas station, critical services, you know, that people need. And then during a disaster, you can tell like which pharmacy has insulin, if they're open, if they're not, you know, on which gas station, if they're open or if they have gas. And one of the things we learned here, I remember one of the critical things is a lot of homes adapted to getting generators, but you need gas to run those generators. And for that kind of lessons learned, we did not have enough gas because all of the 2/3 of all the oil processing plant in Louisiana were, in a sense, not working after Ida. So no gas was coming in, and you get people, you know, for weeks without electricity. And then how do you cook your food? Even something came up, I don't know how I can say this, a local term, they call it gas hole. Like people died. There was death contributed to people fighting over gas. So this is the idea of like, how do you implement large GIS data? Something as simple as how many gas stations or close to you could use, for example, even the Google app that you could just turn on. And Google app, in a sense, is augmented reality. When you're driving, you can see the streets kind of thing, you know. So this idea of like, you know, which is the gas station close to your house and how can you get gas, if they have gas, how long is the line? All those data could be implemented, because there were certain issues where certain gas stations that were not off the beat, that are not on the beat, that were off the beaten path, there won't be any lines, but the gas station that were right on the kind of main thoroughfare, the lines will be around the block. And then, you know, they run out of gas before they get gas, or they just give up after they, you know, they close for the day. So I think these are the very important thing, how tech, and very active tech that could be running concurrently, not in the policy sense that you could talk about a month later. So these are the issues that large data, GIS data, or even the idea of human service, because I think one of the issues that we retroactively, or we should have been more proactive, because we had enough, part of the evacuation, the city assisted evacuation, we have data on people who register, the elderly and the sick. And this idea I previously mentioned, our app is more focusing, has a focus on using the climate justice and equity framework. So the idea of they had that data of who needed a ride out and who was vulnerable, elderly or sick, because they need special bed or oxygen, you know, tanks. And then the city took them about a week to start knocking on doors, because all the cell phone was down, all the electricity was down. So when they did that, they realized, oh my God, we should have done that at the beginning. Open up, you know, that kind of data set, and then having EMS, sheriffs, or even neighbors, you know, you can contact somebody that's closer, because they usually put the closest, you know, point of contact or relative, so they could check on them. So this idea is very important, because and probably after we learn, when we see like how many people died from Ida, it won't be by the kind of typical flooding or wind damage. It'll be more like, you know, people who have pre-existing condition that had 105-degree heat index, that pass naturally, but not. It's really sad.
Yeah, it sounds just super complex, and there's a lot of in order to prepare correctly, preparation that needs to be done ahead of time. Like we need to start thinking about this and working on this now and collecting this information. And so that when it's not like one of these things where the disaster hits and then everyone is scrambling afterwards. And that's going to take a lot of coordination, collaboration, say ownership of individual responsibility in the climate crisis, and the initiative to go out and like create this kind of these data sets and availability of this type of information. I just do want to plug quickly in terms of like how AR can be used to better communicate information. It's for us with Sādu, it's much more to create this like just a stronger connection between someone doing an activity and being able to plant a tree and then see that tree within their phone, within their app, build that collection and potentially share that later on outside of the app itself, maybe sell it on a carbon market. We'll see how it goes. But it basically is this digital representation that contains data about the social and economic value of trees. So it's not just the fact that trees can reduce carbon, but it's also the fact that they can provide food security and they can provide ecosystem restoration. And I guess in some cases, they may be a bit more damaging during climate-related disasters. But it's that complexity that I think AR can maybe help communicate a bit more, a bit easier. So we could think of like the colors that are used to communicate like what information is being displayed, or the way an individual then kind of reacts with the UX UI. Is it just a filter that goes up similar to Instagram, or are there more creative ways to do that? Yeah, I think there's a lot there and I could go on to it, but we have like maybe 1 to 2 more minutes to just talk a bit more about the socio and economic factors that kind of impact the way information is perceived and how that is communicated to policymakers. So what are some like the larger, I would say, barriers or obstacles that you've seen, and how these dynamics between social justice and climate justice kind of interacts with some of the policy or evacuation plans that you're proposing, or readiness plans that you would propose?
Yes, I think even bringing it back to that our collective by Katrina was that like Katrina showed a lot of I would say hidden existing, they were definitely existing social injustice that created really a disaster injustice, and climate justice, even environmental justice within the umbrella of the US, how certain segment of the population has had unequal distribution of its risks and not getting any of its benefit. And then I could definitely map out that using data. But I think it's very difficult to translate that into, usable, I wouldn't say usable, but like connectable information that people can use. For example, I know from our data, if you pick your GPS location, we could tell you on your neighborhood how many trees. But even within that, we could quantify what are the heat island effects, these equal system services that trees do beyond just, for example, reducing the flooding, because each time it rains, the tree itself, the canopy slows down the water, the roots absorbs it, it filters it, all this other great stuff. But even like the sociological, how do you quantify, like, if you have trees in your neighborhood, most likely kids will play out more, it will slow down traffic, all these other stuff that is tough to quantify. Like, within New Orleans, there has been this kind of trying to integrate both the gray and green structure. Gray is super simple. It's a pipe, holds as much water. That's how much, money or risk reduction you can do. But how do you quantify that tree? And I think within, the climate tech business we're in, everybody's still learning. But there's definitely sociological data that you can show that you can correlate to. For example, Uptown, just by the name of New Orleans, Uptown, that's what it's called. It's up, it's on the high part of ground. They have enormous Spanish oak, the Spanish oak that literally covered the whole street. So heat island, it doesn't flood, all the kind of stuff. And then you go to another name called Lower Ninth. There's definitely, even how they name the city, Lower Ninth Ward, it's one of the most vulnerable. And I could definitely, even over something as simple as a GIS map, a satellite map, there's no trees. And within that, you could correlate there's a lot of empty lots. There's definitely a lot more deaths, from those kind of hidden or latent social economic factors, like comorbidity disease. A lot of people who have inflammation, heart diseases. When it gets too hot, they die during the summer, and you can definitely see the spike. So you could connect those kind of data, to say, and once again, these are not causation, these are correlation. If that neighborhood was maybe 10 degrees cooler, you could probably bring down less death, because we could show another neighborhood that has very low deaths because a lot of the houses during the summertime are a lot cooler. And even the idea of uptown and lower Ninth, you can quantify how much is electricity paid per gross income of the family. Is it uptown, or they paying 10% of and in certain neighborhoods, they pay a high percentage, a third of the income is just paying for electricity. And if it's a hot summer, can you afford that third based on your income? So having those data does matter to address, certain social and economic injustice that are now really made apparent with, the climate disaster, the climate injustice. So, and we could definitely go on to larger kind of scale level to see how forests are just being decimated. I think the Amazon previous year was producing more carbon than absorbing, because it just lit on fire. Hundreds of thousands of acres were just burning nonstop.
Yeah, I think that is one of the scarier parts, is that probably humanity's biggest, let's say, helper or partner against managing climate change is now officially kind of having less of a productive effect, in the sense that it is releasing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as a result of the trees that have been basically the roots that are decaying from the trees that have either died or been taken out. And so the amount that it actually absorbs is less than what it emits from the remaining rotting trees. So it's a bit stressful of a problem. And I think it's also super fascinating as well to say, hey, it's not just about planting new trees, but it's also about making sure the ones that we have stay in the ground, right? So as populations in urban areas become more dense, what are the ways that we can prioritize keeping trees as part of like an urban, let's say, planning element? Or as you had mentioned, whether it be the air quality levels from pollution, or the heat island, the ability of an area to reduce the heat. And when people get hot and sweaty and it's difficult for them to sleep at night, how that affects their productivity levels at work the next day. There's just a multiplicity of factors that need to be taken into consideration. And as I think Elise mentioned earlier, it can all sound super, super overwhelming, but the idea is just to start. Like, we got to start somewhere. We can start with exercising. We can start with figuring out what project we want to participate in. We can start with research and data analysis and how to bring all of that together and address these complexities. So it was super awesome. Thank you for sharing, Hoang. I think we're gonna head over to some questions now. And there have been a couple from the audience. And so I believe, David, yes.
I'm coming back. Thank you so much, Brittany. Thank you, Hoang. That was really insightful. And I'm definitely a big fan of the fireside chat approach. It's such a great way to share information, just through conversation. So thank you both for doing that. I guess I've got a couple of questions to kick things off. Just for people at home, there is the Q&A feature as well. So if you want to drop across any questions, drop them on the Q&A. But for the time being, I've definitely got a couple that I've been scribbling away as you guys were talking. So I'll maybe start with you first, Brittany, if that's okay. You were talking there about within Sādu, your projects in terms of planting trees through the platform and stuff like that. I just wondered, what are some of the ways that you evaluate the tree planting projects on your platform? And thanks for jumping back in, Elise, as well. It'd be great to hear from both of you.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share more in what we look at specifically. So there are a lot of projects out there. They all offer like a variety of, let's say, value propositions in order to support, because interestingly enough, the NGO and nonprofit space and tree planting also tends to be a bit competitive. And so there are a lot of organizations out there. Some really focus on transparency, some just focus on community building. I think one of my favorites is definitely Trees for the Future, because they'll work with local communities and farmers to basically plant trees around their crops and ensure that that increases food security and crop yields as well. So it's not just about planting and maintaining the tree as kind of like an agricultural producer, but also using the trees to fight desertification and ensure that they can then sell more of the product that they're initially in business for, and have that replenished in a sustainable manner. So when we're talking with different projects, we're doing multiple interviews with them, getting an understanding for their vision, where they want to be in 5 years, how close they are with the people on the ground that they're working with, what community organizations they're working with. So if they're, based in the US and they're working in Kenya, like who's in between that phase? Where does the funding go? How does it break down? And what actually makes it to the farmer at the end of the day? So this is also a pretty big reason why we're excited about our collaborations with one of our projects called Greenstand, where they're actually looking at the data points of the individual who's putting the seed in the ground and then coming back to check in and creating a way in which we can actually pay this farmer to keep the tree alive, not just like dismiss it once it's planted, but we know where it is based on GPS coordinates, we know who's planting it, we know when they planted it, and we can come back in and check and make sure that that is up and running. So for us, that due diligence is a massive part of what we're working on. And we're implementing that first with Greenstand, and we hope to carry that out through many more projects on the platform as well.
Nice.
But,
yeah, it's nice to hear you're so thorough in terms of picking your partners, which is great to hear. I guess I've got a couple more questions specifically about Sādu, and then Hoang, I'll come to you straight after that. I guess keen to talk a bit more about how you've worked with AR, and actually a few questions in terms of like data sets that you've worked with and things like that as well. So we'll perhaps jump into the data with you, but just super quickly with Sādu before I go any further. What do your typical users look like? I find the concept, great idea, great concept. It'd be great to learn a little bit more about, what you're learning about your users. Are you tracking data points that are showing that actually the app is having this positive impact that you're looking for? Are you changing people's behavior in terms of, the decisions that they're making?
Elise, do you want to go for that?
It's really interesting.
She likes this one.
It's data, right? I get so excited about data all the time. It was really interesting because we actually had a call just before this where we were talking about setting up a challenge for a company that often does challenges like this, where it's all about the well-being and getting people out and moving, which is so important when we sit, in front of our video conferences all day. So that's often something where we can see this be a massive benefit for people, that it's kind of like a kill two birds with one stone in a way, that, you look after yourself and then you also get this positive impact. But the other part that was really interesting is we were looking at some of the kind of standard number of activities that we had modeled at the beginning on how often people work out and exercise. And I think on average, it's, once or twice a week generally. And I would say at the moment with Sadhu App, we're seeing it a much higher. Yes, we do have some of those, but we have a much higher average where I was just taking a picture that you were going to take. Where we're seeing more than once or twice a week. So like there's some people in the app now that we get this message where it's like, I got up and did something today because I knew I was planting trees. And as well, what we're starting to see is that the motivation from the crew side of things, which we haven't touched on in the presentation today, but we have this crew aspect, which is all around, trying to make it a little bit less scary because you're working together and you see your contribution go up collectively. And I think we've also seen that the people in the crews have a higher number of activities being registered as well. So it's all positive in terms of this kind of people who are driven by the trees earned is then having this kind of knock-on effect to them moving more, which is very cool.
It's interesting to see that team dynamic, you know, plays into, I guess, the human aspect of it, isn't it? Doing something with people you work with or your friends to drive that change. That's really interesting to see. In terms of the sort of gamification piece that you guys do, are you know, have you got a roadmap ahead? I mean, I've got a number of apps on my phone that try and help me study and do this different bits and pieces, and you almost get like a day streak or whatever. And, you know, there's points that you collect. And if you miss a day, you have to do all this different stuff. So are you looking at, you know, drilling into this data more and more to kind of drive that positive change? Or is there other things on your roadmap that are perhaps, you know, low hanging fruit? It's better to get the app out there to more people. I don't know. What does the next 6 months look like for Sādu?
I mean, we're super excited. I think maybe Elise, you can share a bit about the play to earn elements that we have coming up. But we're also working on what we like to call NF trees, which is becoming more and more popular. There's an idea out there. So if everyone's familiar with an NFT, you can basically have a concept of digital ownership. And these trees that we can then display in augmented reality will essentially function as an NFT that you can own. And the cool part about that is now that it not only exists within the app, but you can take it out of the app and sell it on the carbon market, which is going to be a thing. We just saw a global commitment to the development of a carbon market by Obama at COP26 today. You have a number of independent private sector projects that are working on these carbon markets as well. And so, you know, in probably a year or 2 years, you'll have the ability to calculate or at least have some verification of the social, economic, and environmental value of the tree, be able to assign that value to the tree in a monetary manner, and then turn around and potentially sell it later on as that tree becomes more valuable because it's alive longer. And so then this kind of also plays into the element of, hey, it's like, yes, it's good for me and I can earn that, but it's also now an investment because we're investing into the future that we want to see. We're investing into a healthy planet, and there's a monetary way to capture that value. So we're stoked.
And we're not going to make it won't be super easy to get there, right? Like, the whole idea is that, I know, oh man, I feel like we're almost contradicting ourselves because we're like, hey, we want to make it a little bit easier for you to contribute, but we do need to keep working on it. It's not going to be fixed overnight. And so I think that's why we want to bring in this kind of play to earn element and associate it with this NF trees concept, which wraps in the AR element as well. And maybe one day we can talk about the database and how that's all going to work one day, because I'm sure some data people will love that. If anyone knows how to do it really well, then please just come and tap on my shoulder. Tap on my shoulder. That'd be great.
I love
but
it.
It's all around. Sorry.
Also, NF trees. That is genius. Like literally genius. Like you've made my evening with that one. So I've got a couple of final questions. I'm conscious of time. Maybe have a couple of final questions and perhaps to wrap things up. This next question, if you don't mind, I'll throw to all of you. Perhaps one of you from Sādu, and then bring Hoang in as well. In terms of the climate crisis and the changes that we have to make, you know, how much of that do you think comes down to individuals? And how much of that actually should be put on almost like whole industries or, you know, whole organizations, whole governments? You know, I think, as I say, you look at it in the big picture, you know, from the outside, I'm perhaps not the best person to come in with these opinions and stuff, but it always blows my mind a little bit when I'm thinking, okay, me personally, right, I get it. I get the scale effect. If everyone's doing it, it's great. But actually, should we be looking at the airline industry as a whole? Should we be looking at farming as a whole? Should we be looking at whole countries and, you know, ways of living, really? So I'd be interested if I could perhaps, you know, if you don't mind, take one from Sādu, as I say, and maybe bring Hoang back in, and then we'll finish off with a couple of quick questions for Hoang as well.
I would say very quickly that I think it's been made very clear that it's something that we've all contributed to. We all have, and you can look at it from a macro level or a micro level, but ultimately a lot of things that happen at the macro level are driven on by the micro level. So I think it's the short answer is that if you want something to change, you have to be the change. And so I think that's a little bit more of a kind of personal motto or a personal way of looking at it. But I think we have to do something, right? Like everyone has to do something now, and you'll reap the benefit. So it's not just about others, everyone will reap the benefit as individuals and at a high level. So that's my 2 cents, I think.
Thanks, Elise. Hoang, could I bring you back in?
Yes, I absolutely agree. I believe that's Gandhi's quote, "Be the change." You know, so I do live with that model. The idea of the dichotomy locally and globally, they have to work well together. Even and look into the idea of previous points that Brittany and Elise brings up, the idea of how do you quantify such complex data. You know, when I say we Sisyphus, and when I say we as in my 2 PhD colleagues in computer science and nanotech. They are well more versed in this. They probably give you a better description. One of the ways we're exploring is using, for example, both LiDAR and SARS data, synthetic aperture radar. The idea is, I previously mentioned, we have mapped all the trees and what species it is. And but we don't know how old the tree is, you know, or how big the tree is. So with this, you can once again quantify, you know, the foliage resource data, give textures of the leaves and also the height, you know. And this is very complex stuff that you probably have to bring into AI, that we are bringing to AI. We're working with IBM, their Watson AI machine learning algorithm to process these data. What are the best models? What are the best way to, you know, have these data usable and then translatable where people understand. But even the idea of like, that's for the urban. There is another thing that people are doing where it's more very high tech. It's like super lasers, same kind of thing, but it's this contraption they put in the middle of the forest and it shoots millions of lasers and it just digitally maps the whole forest. And with that, you can, this acre of forest capture this much CO2. That's quantifiable. Not like, oh, I think it does this much. No, you can quantify that. And then you can also go through and then, I've always mentioned like the age of the tree, like, you know, a lot of forest management, it's like what tree to cut down, what tree to cut down. If a machine can go down and then tell you like, you know, these are the aging tree, these are the newer tree, and it tells you pin GPS and you go through and you do better forest management. So, and I can only imagine take that into the city scope, you know, scope, how we can quantify, like I previously mentioned, like how much water could be absorbed, heat island effect, all the other kind of social and eco service that trees perform that we don't know of, you know. So definitely that is the future. I bow to the data god and AI, all that.
And it's going to make the impact. I love to hear it. I love to hear it. Final question, I think, from me, and I'll come to you, Hoang, and it is, again, kind of on that data-focused theme. I think it was clear in the you know, fireside chat with you that actually influencing policymakers and decision makers is, you know, is a big part of this, actually. So I was keen to hear, you know, why did you decide AR was the best way to communicate your findings to the policymakers?
For me, I don't think I decided AR. I have done multiple community engagement, and each time you show a table or a map, it just freaks people out. And I think I probably give this to my niece. My niece is a nephew. We were stuck in the pandemic, and then it was just so the new way to communicate. I remember I taught my 3-year-old niece, how to play augmented chess over 5G internet. And I was like, this is such a new master switch. Henry Wu, the idea of like a way to communicate. It's like going, for example, back in the past, from the newspaper to the radio. You would read about your house got hit by a hurricane 5 weeks after it happened, when they get everything, or you could hear over the radio, get into your shelter, you know? So this idea of how technology is moving so fast. And even for me, it took the pandemic for me to adjust, because before, you know, you just talk over radio or you go visit your family, and now it's like you're stuck at home talking. So I would probably say I give that credit to my nieces and nephews, seeing how teaching something so complex with real, and once again, we hope we could do the same. We're still learning, you know, how the best, and this is the idea of the user kind of flow and user's journey, you know, learning from each successful kind of deviation, how best to do it.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Hoang. And thank you very much, all of you, for being part of this year's Data Science Festival. It was great to follow up Brittany and Elise 12 months later, and hopefully we get this chance to do that again in 12 months' time, and we could be part of the growth of Sadhu App. So yeah, just to draw things to a close, thank you for joining us at home. Thank you to Brittany, Hoang and Elise for coming and sharing with us this evening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I hope you've enjoyed us joining us this evening, and hopefully we'll see you at some more events going forward. So thank you all very much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you for the invite.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye-bye.
Bye.